She sat on the throne of England. But the true story of Queen Anne is one of profound personal heartbreak. What if the most powerful woman in the land was also the most tragic? We're diving deep into the devastating secret of her many lost heirs, a story that will change how you see her forever. The year was 1702. The bells of Westminster rang not in celebration, but in cautious relief. England had a queen again, Anne Stuart, daughter of James II, sister of the executed Mary, the last of her line to bear a crown.
To her subjects, she was the embodiment of divine providence, graceful, devout, a mother to the nation. Yet inside the palace walls, she lived surrounded not by courtiers, but by absence. The nursery at St. James's Palace was her private kingdom, a place once filled with cradles, physicians, and whispered prayers. But by the time she ascended the throne, it had become a museum of loss. 17 pregnancies, 17 endings.
Only one child had drawn breath long enough to be named and cherished: William, Duke of Gloucester, the boy who was supposed to save a dynasty. He died at 11. Anne's reign would be marked not only by the Act of Union, the Wars of Marlborough, or the rise of empire, but by an invisible sorrow that shaped every decision she made. The queen who gave stability to her realm could never find it in her own body. Her enemies called her weak, sickly, hysterical. They did not know that she walked through history carrying the weight of 17 small coffins. She prayed nightly for the souls she could not keep. Her letters speak not of politics, but of aching hope. If it please God to grant me one more child. Each time she signed a treaty, opened Parliament, or smiled for portraits, she did so as a mother who had lost her entire world. In portraits, her gaze seems heavy, almost defiant, as though daring the painter to see beyond the crown. Behind the silken ermine, there is a woman counting ghosts. This is not the story of a monarch triumphant, but of a heart that beat beneath layers of velvet and grief. Tonight, we open the doors of her silent nursery, step into the candlelight of her prayers and ask, how does a woman rule an empire when her own bloodline is dying one heartbeat at a time? From the outside, St. James's Palace glittered like the beating heart of empire. Courtiers moved through its corridors with powdered grace. Diplomats waited for audiences beneath frescoed ceilings, and servants carried silver trays heavy with ceremony. Yet for Queen Anne, those same corridors were haunted. Every room she entered carried the echo of a child who had once breathed there. Behind the velvet curtains and tapestries embroidered with angels were the ghosts of cradles long since removed. Nurses who had once sung lullabies now folded linens for the dead. The Queen's private physician, Dr. Arbuthnot, kept a list of the lost heirs, written not in ink but in grief. He said she never read it, though she knew every name by heart. Anne's health reflected her mourning. Years of gout, dropsy, and exhaustion left her swollen and unable to walk without pain. She hid her legs behind layers of fabric, the body of a queen cloaking the suffering of a woman. Her physicians spoke of melancholy humors. Her husband, Prince George of Denmark, wept quietly when she prayed for yet another child, even after her body could no longer bear the risk. At night, the palace glowed with hundreds of candles, but none of them reached her chambers. She preferred dimness, the kind that softened portraits and blurred memories. There, beside her prayer stool, lay a small chest lined with satin. Inside were locks of hair, tiny ribbons, and christening spoons, each belonging to a child who never grew beyond infancy. She ruled from this sepulchre of memory, surrounded by courtiers who mistook her stillness for indifference. But those who served close to her, maids, chaplains, doctors, knew the truth. The Queen carried a private funeral wherever she went. The palace was her tomb, and the nation her mausoleum. When foreign ambassadors addressed her as Your Majesty, Mother of the Realm, she bowed slightly, not out of pride but of irony. For in the nursery, beneath a canopy embroidered with crowns and cherubs, the cradle of England's future stood empty. She ordered it covered, but not removed. Sometimes, when the night was particularly quiet, she would ask her attendants to read aloud from the Psalms. "I am forgotten as a dead man out of mind. I am like a broken vessel." The words filled the chamber, steady as breath, fading into silence that no title could break. History remembers numbers, but numbers can never hold pain. 17 pregnancies, each one a brief flare of hope, extinguished before it could warm the world. To most, it is a statistic whispered by scholars. To Anne, it was a rosary of grief, each bead carved from another failure of flesh. Her first child, Mary, lived for only a few hours. The next, Anne Sophia, breathed for a year before fever took her. The third, George, Prince of Denmark, died before baptism. The fourth never drew breath at all. On and on it went. Years of prayers, physicians, miscarriages, stillbirths. She wrote in her diary, "I have known sorrow upon sorrow." The court moved on. They always did. Each announcement of pregnancy was greeted with cannon fire and celebration. Each funeral was smaller, quieter, the musicians playing slower, as if even sound grew weary of mourning. Midwives came and went. Clergy repeated the same prayers until the words lost meaning. The Queen sat pale and still, watching another tiny coffin vanish beneath the flagstones of Westminster Abbey. She believed each death was her punishment. Her father, King James II, had been driven from his throne for his Catholic faith. Anne, a Protestant queen, saw divine irony in her barrenness. In the stillness of her chapel, she whispered, "God has judged the house of Stuart unfit to endure." Her one surviving son, William, Duke of Gloucester, became her redemption and her fear. Sickly since birth, the boy grew up surrounded by doctors and prayers. He was her light, clever, affectionate, fragile as glass. She refused to leave his side, even when gout crippled her legs. At 11, after a seizure, he died in her arms. The crown's future died with him. Witnesses say she did not scream. She simply turned her face away and whispered, "He is safe now." Then she ordered his toys burned, so that memory itself would not mock her. The nation grieved for the dynasty. The mother grieved for her soul. Political pamphlets praised her fortitude. None spoke of the nights she sat in her wheelchair beside an extinguished fire, holding the boy's last shoe as though it could still walk. In portraits painted after his death, she wore black pearls, the color of tears too proud to fall. Behind her, artists placed cherubs, unaware of the cruelty. Each new parliament session, each war report, each royal christening of another family's child, became a silent reminder of the line that would end with her. To rule is to endure. Yet Anne's endurance was not power. It was penance. 17 times she had hoped to give England an heir. 17 times her body had betrayed her. And in a world that worshipped lineage, she became both queen and empty cradle. If Queen Anne's womb had failed her, her heart still sought companionship, and found it in the most unlikely of allies, Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. They had known each other since girlhood, bound first by affection, later by power. To Anne, Sarah was more than a friend. She was the sister she had never kept, the voice that dared to speak truth in a court of flatterers. To Sarah, the Queen was an instrument, a woman of feeling easily guided by the forceful will of another. Their letters began tenderly. Anne signed hers, "Your faithful Mrs. Morley," while Sarah answered as Mrs. Freeman, a disguise that let them speak as equals. In a world where a monarch could command armies but not her own body, these small illusions were Anne's refuge. Together they built an empire of intimacy amid a kingdom of politics. But affection is fragile when weighed against ambition. As Anne's health worsened and her grief deepened, Sarah's tone hardened. She mocked the Queen's tears, called her lazy, whispered that her ailments were excuses. When Prince George died, Sarah urged Anne to end her mourning, reminding her that nations did not pause for sorrow. Anne's reply was quiet, but final. "You have not lost what I have lost." The Duchess's husband, John Churchill, was England's hero, Marlborough, Victor of Blenheim. His fame and Sarah's arrogance grew unbearable. Courtiers soon realized that influence over the Queen ran through Sarah's hands. Yet the friendship that had once sustained Anne now became her torment. Sarah ridiculed her piety, her corpulence, even her handwriting. The Queen endured it all, unwilling to lose the one person who still spoke to her without fear. When a new figure appeared at court, Abigail Masham, a distant cousin of Sarah's and a quiet attendant to the Queen, the balance shifted. Abigail's gentleness soothed where Sarah's brilliance burned. Anne found peace in her silence, a balm after years of command. Sarah, sensing her power slipping, lashed out with venom disguised as counsel. She accused Abigail of corruption, of witchcraft, even of seducing the Queen's favor for profit. The quarrel became legend. Letters turned into weapons, tears into policy. When the Duchess publicly humiliated Anne at a church service, demanding she dismiss Abigail before communion, the Queen's reply was measured, devastating. "I shall remember your service, but I can no longer bear your temper." Their friendship ended as all of Anne's loves did, in loss. Sarah was dismissed. The Churchills exiled for a time. The Queen remained alone, surrounded by loyal faces that mirrored no emotion. The court called it political necessity. History calls it heartbreak. In her final years, she would often speak Sarah's name, then fall silent, as if reciting the title of a vanished book she could no longer bear to open. By the last decade of her reign, Queen Anne had become a monument of contradictions, beloved yet ridiculed, powerful yet utterly alone. She ruled over a growing empire, signed acts that united kingdoms, and presided over victories abroad, yet her own body and spirit were crumbling beneath the weight of both grief and expectation. Gout twisted her joints until she could scarcely stand. Dropsy swelled her limbs until the smallest movement became an agony. Servants lifted her from bed to chair each morning as though handling relics. The royal robes, once symbols of majesty, now hung like shackles. She was only in her 40s, but every portrait aged her beyond recognition. Outside the palace, pamphleteers mocked her as fat, pious, and foolish. They could not see the woman who wept behind drawn curtains, begging God to take her quietly. Ministers jostled for favor while she sat motionless, her crown pressing down like lead. Every decision she made seemed to carry ghosts. When she signed the Act of Union in 1707, binding England and Scotland into Great Britain, her hand trembled. She whispered, "Two kingdoms joined, while my own line is severed." The wars in Europe consumed what little energy she had left. Each dispatch from Marlborough's campaigns brought both pride and pain. Pride in England's triumphs, pain in remembering the woman who had once shared those letters with her. Every victory reminded her of the friendship she had buried alive. Her nights were worse. Unable to sleep, she demanded scripture be read aloud until dawn. When the verses spoke of barren women blessed by faith, she would close her eyes and murmur, "Not I." The palace grew quieter with each passing year, its mirrors veiled, its windows shuttered against the sound of life outside. In council, she was calm, but slow to speak. Ministers learned to interpret her silences, each pause a negotiation between conscience and exhaustion. The Archbishop once said that, "Her Majesty's heart is most tender, yet it is locked." He was right. Behind every decree was a woman afraid that history would forget the difference between her reign and her sorrow. By 1713, her body had become her final prison. Her legs ulcerated, her lungs heavy with fluid. The court whispered of divine punishment. Anne called it mercy's approach. She once told her chaplain, "I have lived in labor and shall die in it." It was both confession and prophecy. On summer nights, she would have her wheelchair taken to a window overlooking the palace gardens. There she watched the torchlights fade into the distance and whispered the names of children no one else remembered. For a moment, England's queen ceased to exist, and only Anne, the mother who had never stopped mourning, remained. By the summer of 1714, the end had already begun. The palace smelled faintly of vinegar and candle wax, the air thick with the hush of attendants who had learned that hope was impolite. Queen Anne's body had betrayed her for years, but now even her heart, once fierce, once stubborn, was failing in slow surrender. Physicians hovered like crows in silk coats, arguing in whispers about which treatment would kill her less quickly. Outside, London buzzed with gossip. Who would inherit the throne when the Queen's breath stopped? The House of Stuart had no living child, no next in line born of her blood. The Whigs whispered of Hanover, the Tories of divine right, and all the while the Queen lay between prayers and stupor, the living argument of a dying dynasty. Her chamber at Kensington was dim. Heavy curtains shut out the July light. Flies gathered on the window glass, drawn to the scent of lavender meant to mask decay. The Queen's skin was mottled, her voice reduced to a whisper. Each breath rattled like parchment. "Pray," she murmured. "Always pray." Those were words she had said all her life, to doctors, servants, ministers. But now they were for herself. When she slept, she dreamed of the nursery. She called out to William, her lost son, as if he still played in the corridors. Nurses wept quietly. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood by the bed, reading Psalm 39. "Make me to know mine end, and the measure of my days." She nodded faintly, as though finally understanding the verse that had eluded her through decades of loss. Sarah Churchill was gone. Reconciliation never came. Yet in the final hours, the Queen asked that the Duchess's portrait be uncovered from the storeroom. She gazed at it for a long time and said, "She loved me once." No one dared answer. At dawn, her pulse faltered. The attendants waited for a royal physician to pronounce what they already knew. Her lips moved one last time. Some claimed she whispered Gloucester, others swore it was forgive. The word itself didn't matter, only the tenderness of it. When the bells of London finally tolled, they sounded hollow, weary, like instruments that remembered too much sorrow. Outside the palace gates, rain began to fall, thin and cold, as though the sky itself mourned the final Stuart. Her body was dressed in white satin and pearls, the color of purity and mourning combined, and laid in state beneath the dome of Westminster Abbey. Beneath the crown rested a hand once swollen with pain, now still. 17 tiny souls, imagined and real, seemed to keep vigil beside her. The dynasty ended with a whisper. England looked toward the German princes of Hanover, strangers who would inherit her throne but not her story. And in the hush of that July morning, the empire took its next breath, while the woman who had given it everything took her last. Centuries have passed, and still her name drifts like incense through the corridors of history. Queen Anne, the forgotten monarch of an age that preferred to remember her generals and poets. Her reign built the great Britain we know, yet her story remains written in whispers, hidden behind portraits that flatter but never feel. The marble effigy at Westminster shows a serene queen, hands clasped, gaze lifted toward eternity. Few notice the inscription below, simple, almost austere, in hope of resurrection. Beneath that stone lies not just a ruler, but the final echo of a bloodline that shaped England for 1,000 years. She left no child, no heir, only a crown passed to strangers, and a grief that belonged solely to her. In the centuries since her death, historians have struggled to measure her reign, the Act of Union, the victories at Blenheim and Ramillies, the birth of constitutional monarchy. Yet none of these define her as deeply as the silence she carried. For Anne's tragedy was not political, it was human. In a world obsessed with succession, she lived every day as proof of what could not be continued. The courtiers who once mocked her ailments died forgotten. The men who questioned her faith are names in footnotes. But her story, quiet and enduring, has outlived them all. Modern physicians now believe her illnesses, lupus, diabetes, perhaps autoimmune collapse, robbed her of fertility. Science has given her an alibi, but not an absolution. History seldom forgives what it cannot understand. At Kensington Palace, the small chest she once kept remains preserved. A collection of ribbons, baby caps, and tiny spoons, each tagged in her own handwriting. Visitors rarely see it. It's kept away from the main exhibits, too intimate for display. Yet it is the truest monument to her life, a kingdom of memories, untouched by politics. Outside, the gardens she once admired bloom each spring, their blossoms brief, beautiful, and gone by summer. The gardeners still call one path the Queen's Walk. They do not know that she asked to be wheeled there at dusk, to listen for the sound of children she never met. When the wind moves through the leaves, it sounds almost like laughter. In the end, Anne's story is not about failure, but endurance. She bore pain with dignity, loss with devotion, and left behind a nation stronger than she ever felt herself to be. Her 17 lost heirs became her unspoken legacy. 17 reasons why compassion, not conquest, should define greatness. If this story followed you into the dark tonight, let it stay. Leave a thought for the woman who ruled an empire but could not save her own heart. And if you choose to listen again, step deeper into the labyrinth of forgotten truths, because some sorrow deserves to be remembered, no matter how long it sleeps.